Welcome to the community of digital artists. I'm your host, Kevin Osborne. Now for tonight's speaker. Justin Black is a photographer, writer, and explorer from Washington, D.C., a leader in his field. His photographs of the world's diverse landscapes and the creatures and people that inhabit them have been published widely and featured in numerous exhibitions around the U.S. and abroad, from the UK and Germany to Los Angeles and the United States Capitol building. Several exhibitions of his work have been hosted at Mountain Light Gallery in California, founded by the world-renowned adventure photographer Galen Rowell. He is fortunate and perhaps unique among his peers in having had the opportunity to collaborate and co-teach with the who's who of masters of American nature photography. And I'll just name a few: Jack Dykinga, Galen Rowell, Frans Lanting, Charles Cramer, Paul Caponigro, Muench, Robert Glenn Ketchum, Art Wolfe, Tom Mangelsen. If you know nature photographers, that's a pretty impressive list. He is a former director of the International League of Conservation Photographer, and he leads photo workshops, and he has his own travel company called Visionary Wild. Has achieved a superlative reputation for delivering world-class photographic experiences for passionate photographers. And they're all led by Justin and his team of professional peers. And Mark and I participated in one of his workshops down the Grand Canyon recently. It was fabulous. So it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Justin Black to CODA.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Let me put you on the screen here. Yeah, right now you look like a turtle, sorry.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. And I wish I was there with you guys instead of sitting here in my office at 10 at night. I think it'd be a lot more fun to be there with you guys. Yeah, it was a great overview of Henri Cartier-Bresson's career and impact on the photographic world. He's certainly somebody I've paid a lot of attention to. And when we do workshops in Paris, we actually get a private tour of his foundation gallery there that is a really amazing place if you ever get a chance to visit. But anyway, basically this talk is about ways. Basically, it's about your toolkit, about ways to tackle different situations, different options you have for treating different kinds of situations and different kinds of subject matter, different kinds of light, and just the scenarios you'll encounter out there in the field. Just to begin with, I often think of sort of the 4 steps to making a photograph. First of all, there's just wanting to do it. The desire to share your own personal vision, and everybody's vision is unique. And I find that desiring to do that is actually a good thing to start with. It definitely helps. And then discovery, identifying and studying a subject that appeals to you, that draws you, that you connect with somehow, and then studying it, developing awareness, just to develop an awareness of its character and traits, and that stimulates ideas about how to photograph it, how to communicate to other people what it is about this thing that excites you. Visualization. You're probably all aware of the idea of just being able to anticipate what the final image is going to look like when you see a situation in nature and in the world. And I think there are some images in this slideshow that sort of drive that idea home. And then execution. How is it exactly we're going to make this picture? Finding the perspective, choosing the right framing, and all the technique you're going to use either in the camera or in processing after the fact. And going through that process sort of gets you thinking through, all the available options for how to handle a situation, how to overcome these challenges that we face out there in the world when the light isn't exactly what we want, or our preconceived notions of what we were thinking we were going to be photographing, or how we were going to be photographing it, maybe don't quite work out the way we'd hoped. Because my general approach is that there's always a solution. You know, there's always a good picture to be made, and it's just about being open-minded and also aware of what your options are. And so we'll be talking about the decisive moment, you know, finding perspective, and how to treat perspective. You know, dealing with multiple exposures in various ways, long exposure, super fast exposures, you know, flash and supplemental light, night and low light photography, the black and white image, and how that differs from color, stitched compositions, and high dynamic range exposures. So anyway, first I want to talk about unseen images. And basically this is just pictures that, you know, when you're looking at the world, you don't see them the way that they're going to end up in the picture. You know, this is sort of a classic, you know, water shot, long exposure water shot. And, you know, we don't see this until it's rendered by the camera. And, you know, the key to visualization is being able to anticipate, you know, what that final image is going to look like once you've made it. And, you know, this takes just practice and experience, you know, looking at the world and saying, you know what, if I run this as a 2-second exposure, then all the lines are going to simplify, the texture is going to sort of blur, and I'm going to be working with a simpler set of information and shapes than I would be if I shot it at a 2/50th of a second. You know, it's pretty elementary in a way, but you know, I think it's really good to think about these things. You know, this is a dusky dolphin in New Zealand, and again, you know, there were dolphins all around the boat I was in, and I was seeing opportunities like this come and go, but at no moment did I actually see the dolphin arranged, you know, with the, you know, the ripples on the water, just so, you know, I had to apply a polarizing filter to cut the glare so that I could see through the water, or the surface reflection off the water to the dolphin. And, you know, you sort of realize this is happening, but it's all happening so fast. You don't have you don't really see the image until you've made it, right? So you've got to sort of recognize the possibility is there, and then anticipate it, and then try, you know, various iterations as the action's happening, and hoping that you'll get the right result. And this is something that happens out there in the world under the right conditions, called birefringence, which is basically something that happens in crystals. Sorry, can you hear me? I was getting some feedback there, I think. Anyway, this is something that happens in the crystals of ice that form on the surface of water. Particularly, like this was shot in Kyrgyzstan on a meltwater glacier, or meltwater pool on a glacier rather, that, you know, froze new crystals of ice overnight. And normally you just look at this and you'd see just sort of basically white and sort of bluish ice crystals. But what's happening is the sunlight's being filtered through ice crystals up high in clouds in the atmosphere, and that's partially polarizing the light. And then if you apply a polarizing filter, it actually amplifies that effect. And so, you know, when you're looking at this, you just barely see the you know, the palette of colors, the gamut of colors, but you know, you put on the polarizer and suddenly they jump out. This is something that, again, you know, you don't see it when you're out there walking around until you apply your tools and techniques, and just about being aware that the possibility is there, and knowing the conditions that will create it. And this is something that, you know, again, I didn't see this happen. I made this happen by, I was standing in the middle of a courtyard at the Louvre in Paris, and we were photographing at night, and we were doing all these, you know, sort of fairly predictable night shots of, you know, people walking through the courtyard, and the sodium vapor lights and the lights of the buildings and things like that. And I just decided to, you know, after I'd done a bunch of obvious stuff, I'd, you know, just set up a long exposure, I think about 10 seconds, and I would just rotate 360 degrees while also rotating the camera on the lens's axis like this, just for fun. And, you know, after I did that once, I looked at the back of the camera. It's like, oh, there's something here. You know, there's a, you know, I really like the way these lines were sort of carving their way across the scene. And so I did it several more times, and every one was different. obviously, but they were all shot. It was dark, basically black background with sort of that warm sodium vapor look to it. So it very much looked like exactly what it was, which was a blurred sort of long exposure, moving the camera with lights in the scene. So what I did was I took it into Lightroom and I just inverted the curve, which made the blacks white and the whites black. So all the dark lines you see here are actually where the lights carved the path across the scene, and the white is where the black background would have been. And it also inverts the color. So the things that were warm tone actually go blue. And again, this is, may or may not be your cup of tea. This is not for everybody, but just sort of playing with abstraction and design. And it's just an option that you have. And flash photography, we don't see that when we're out there in the field. You have to sort of learn to anticipate what it's going to do. Unfortunately now, with digital, we have immediate feedback, and we can sort of look at the result and tweak it. But this was a little wild orchid out in the middle of a forest on Mount Tamalpais in Marin County, and it was just basically the background was really cluttered, and even though I had the ambient light to photograph the flower, I decided to sort of clean things up by forcing the background black with using flash as a primary light source. Just turning the background into a black backdrop just by virtue of exposure. Similar idea here. This is a pygmy bromeliad boa in Costa Rica, and this is all flash illumination at night. And so I had a strobe on the camera and a strobe held above the leaf to cast the shadow of the snake's tail through the leaf. It didn't look at all like this when I was looking at it. This is just something where you got to know what's possible through anticipation and experience. And this is a softbox flash shot of tadpoles in a glass frog egg case in Costa Rica. And same thing, I'm in the middle of a dark rainforest and find this interesting subject and murky light, and things were moving a little bit with the breeze, so out came the flash. So decisive moments. This is pretty much a decisive moment if there ever was one. It's a jaguar in the Pantanal in Brazil catching a Yacaré caiman. The cat's about 300 pounds and the caiman's about 150 to 200 pounds. This was this brief story behind this, but we've been following this jaguar for, I don't know, probably an hour. And the jaguars, if they're hunting, they're praising the river, so they tend to follow the riverbank. And usually if you find one walking along the riverbank one way, it'll continue on that path until it, makes an attempt at the prey item. And in this case, he came out on a beach that was about, 500 feet to the left of this shot, and started trotting down the beach. And then suddenly he realizes that up ahead there's a little channel, and then across the channel there's this sandbar that had a few caiman on it on one side, and then capybaras, which are the world's largest rodent, on the backside. And he immediately sort of slunk down and switched into stalking mode. And the lesson from this picture really was that, we weren't sure what he was going after. It could have been the capybaras, which were on the backside that we didn't really have access to because our boat couldn't get in there. And so I hoped that he would go for this guy because he was in the best position to make a picture. So I thought, well, I'm not going to get good pictures of the capybaras if he goes for them. And the other caiman wasn't in a good position either. So I asked our boatman to set up on this guy, and we just crossed our fingers. And sure enough, he swam across the channel, came up behind the backside of the sandbar, and paused for a second, and then with just 2 leaps, jumped over and pushed this caiman with his momentum into the river somewhat, and grabbed him by the back of the neck, and then crushed his spine, paralyzed it, and then swam back across the channel in about 10 seconds, and he disappeared into the bush. Sort of like Cartier-Bresson setting up and waiting for the cyclist, that he hopes comes. This was the same thing. I didn't know this was going to happen, but I hoped it would happen. I knew it was possible it would happen, and we basically found the best position to photograph it if it did happen. And that Cayman really wishes he was doing this instead. This is basically a territorial and mating call, which is like a 64 hertz low frequency vibration that it just causes the water on the caiman's back to dance. And they only do this just as the first rays of the sun sort of kiss the water at about, usually when we're down there, it's about 7:30 in the morning, something like that. And they do it for a very brief period of time, and then they stop for the day. And so you really have to find one that looks like he's about to grunt, and set up on it with the light in the right spot. This is another perfect example of how important a subject, even a small subject that's sort of immediately readable, can be in the context of a landscape. This is a skua in Antarctica, just flying in front of an iceberg that's detached from the glacier in the background. And this is a massive iceberg, but the skua is it's all about sort of the position of the skua. And so I've been photographing just the iceberg against the glacier because I love this nice backlit curve. And then I noticed the skua is flying around, and I just framed it up, and I thought, boy, I hope he flies into that spot. And sure enough, he did. And it's just about being framed up and ready, and making sure your shutter speed's fast enough to freeze it and all that. And this is at South Georgia Island. King penguins going to sea for their morning bath. This is the sort of thing where they're coming and going all day, but it's the particular thing they do early in the morning when they go out en masse like this. And it's knowing that they're going to do this, so that you arrange to go ashore early enough to catch it, because often this can happen at 4 in the morning, or 4 or 5 in the morning, and most vessels that visit there wouldn't go ashore that early at all. So you have to make special arrangements to do that, and then you can only do that if you know that it's going to happen. So we made sure we were there and set up and ready to go. This is a leopard seal on ice, obviously, and this was on a small vessel that we use in Antarctica called the Hans Hansen, which it's basically we bring about 10 guests along. It's a 75-foot Norwegian rescue boat that's been converted into a sort of a small expedition cruise ship. It's a wonderful platform, because instead of having to go out into zodiacs all the time, if you want to sort of tool around icebergs and that sort of thing, you just stay on the ship, because it's small enough that it can, and nimble enough that it can move in places that pretty much anywhere you want to go. And so while we're underway, I'll spend a lot of time out on the deck, and just sort of keep an eye at what's sliding past the ship. And here we were sort of moving through this channel, quite slowly, but I'm always looking ahead to see what's coming up. And sure enough, I see this little sort of small iceberg with a leopard seal all sitting on top of it, and I knew it was going to come right by. And what I really paid attention to then was the background. So I framed up, using these mountains in the distance as my reference for the composition, and just held it there until the leopard seal slid into the right spot. And similar thing here. This is sort of like Cartier-Bresson's bicyclist. This is a situation where I found the sort of the stage for the actor to enter, and just framed it up and waited. This is at a monastery in Ladakh in northern India, and I knew this was an active temple, basically, or an active temple, and people were coming and going. And I just, stood there with my composition, and then as people would come and go, I'd make pictures, and sure enough, this nun came in, and the rest is history. But the key thing is the light, and the fact that she's illuminated by the light of the doorway against a dark shadow. And another case of small subject in a big scene making all the difference, sort of like the skua earlier. This is a horseman in Kyrgyzstan, which is one of my favorite places to lead trips. And he had actually we were there to photograph the light on the mountains at sunset, and he had a herd of sheep across the river, and he just got curious about these people standing there with tripods. So he rode across and sort of asked, he was just purely curious, just asked what we were up to, and was interested, and chatted for a little while. And I thought to myself, well, he's definitely going to go back to his sheep. So we set up, and I just was hoping upon hope that he would ride through that little highlight on the water there. And fortunately he did. But again, it's a case of setting up for the picture that you hope happens, that's plausible, that's possible. And that's the best case scenario, and go for it. And if it works out, it's great. If it doesn't, then you try again. And you have decisive moments of light too. This is a long exposure at sunset, but it's right at the moment where the sun's transitioning across the horizon. And so for part of this exposure, the sun was up, and for part of it, the sun was down. This is probably something like a 12 or 20 second exposure. That transitional light, it obviously knocks down the overall contrast so that you can capture all of the tonalities in one exposure, from the deepest shadows to the brightest highlights, with the exception of the actual disk of the sun. But because it actually dropped below the horizon for part of the exposure, even that is sort of within range. And this is sort of a classic decisive moment of lighting situation. This was in the Eastern Sierra, where I used to live, near Bishop, California. And I was up, photographing the fall color in the aspens in Bishop Canyon, totally different, focusing on a totally different composition, looking a different direction. And, what I didn't tune into, because I was shooting 4x5 film, and I was under my dark cloth and fixated on a particular composition. What I didn't really realize was happening was that the sun was working its way up over the mountains on one side of the canyon, and then illuminating the slope behind me. And as it came down and down and down, it was kicking more and more warm light in, and then it eventually hit the canopy of yellow leaves above, or actually behind me, which was sort of over my left shoulder, and kicked this warm light into the trunks of aspens in the foreground here. And I, when that happened, I noticed the change in illumination. I looked over and I went, oh my God, look at this. And the problem was, because I was shooting a 4x5 film camera, in order to set up and get the camera all set, would have taken longer than I had, because after only about a minute or 90 seconds, the sun was in this composition. And once you had direct sunlight on the canopy within the composition, then it just would have blown out and wouldn't have worked. So I took note of the situation, and I came back the next morning hoping for similar conditions. And fortunately, I got them and was able to be there in time to set up and get this shot. But again, this is a window of 60 seconds to make this shot, because otherwise the lighting completely changes. And perspective. So, classic near far kind of situation. This is ice over a lake in Iceland. The key with these kind of near far shots with a wide angle lens is that, you're looking out at the top of the frame into the distance and looking down sort of at your feet in the foreground. And that is a wonderful technique for, just sort of letting the viewer imagine themselves sort of stepping into the scene. And so it creates a real connection with the place. And the key here really is working the lines, obviously, this triangle coming out of the bottom right-hand corner, leading up to these sort of Z-shaped zigzags in the upheaved ice. And you know, I didn't really need any sky. There wasn't really anything interesting going on in the sky, but I wanted that sunlit band of mountains at the top, obviously for color contrast, if nothing else. And then some near far shots are not that far. This is in West Virginia, and you know, obviously, as you know, working with these eddied pools, sort of counter rotating, you know, eddies as a foreground subject. And again, you know, wide angle lens that, you know, forces you to get close to your foreground subject, because the wide angle lens tends to push the subject away. So to counter that, you just move closer, you know, it really enhances the sense of flow. In this case, you know, you have this sort of this S-curve flow from the foreground up through the channel, through the middle, and then up to the waterfall in the back. This is a situation where when I saw this situation, the lighting was totally different, because I was standing on a bridge up above these leaves in a little pool in a creek in Zion National Park. As I was looking down on it, the lighting down there was really drab, and you know, it was just shade light. It wasn't really interesting at all, and the leaves were kind of old and sort of getting moldy and stuff, and not all that interesting. But I realized that if I was down at the water level looking toward the sunlit, you know, sandstone cliffs, I'd get this orange reflection in the water. So sure enough, I jumped down there and work with reflection. And the thing that I wasn't anticipating was how wonderful the sort of the surface tension of the water would be with regard to the reflecting the, you know, working the blue into you know, sort of framing the leaves. And you know, the color of the leaves, these leaves were actually sort of yellow and brown and that sort of thing, but they go blue because they're reflecting skylight. And this is just a matter of, you know, changing perspective. This is at Mount Cook in New Zealand, and you know, we're at Mount Cook Village, just down, you know, in this valley very close to the mountains. And the only problem was, you know, we had nice light on Mount Cook and the sky and the clouds. But you know, it was pretty murky down there in the valley, and there wasn't all that much great foreground to work with, and no reflecting pools, and nothing really picking up any color or anything. So, you know, I turned the other way and just started working with silhouettes, and there weren't that many trees or anything either. So in this case, I dove into basically a big bush thicket, and the trick here was just trying to find a position that separated those branches as much as possible so that the silhouettes would read cleanly. And then in the, you know, the mountain, you know, being the brightest subject in the scene, and having, you know, that sort of that warm, cool contrast against the sky, you know, that it's going to hold its own anyway. So it can be small in the frame. That's not a problem. And it really becomes more about the thicket than about the mountain. The mountain just becomes sort of a place setter. And you know, this is a classic situation where perspective is everything. You know, this scene was you know, it was sort of complex. There was a lot going on, and sort of distilling this composition out of it was a little bit of a trick, in the sense that, you know, you had to be in just the right spot and see it to begin with. And like, this was the actual iceberg, and there's a lot going on all the way around this iceberg. There was interesting stuff to photograph. You know, I sort of realized that the interesting thing to me was actually this overhanging shaded area that created, you know, a separation for the hole in the ice. And obviously this lovely feature in the foreground was a natural juxtaposition. But you know, the key here was eliminating the background, eliminating sort of the highlights outside the framing area, and just distilling it down to the simplest essence of it. This is also down in Antarctica, and you know, the key here with the wide angle lens, you know, getting close to ice in the water with a you know, polarizer so that you can see under the water and see the iceberg underneath, and getting low enough in a zodiac so that you're also looking up at the iceberg against the sky. this is a mountain in Kyrgyzstan, it's about a 19,000 foot mountain in Kyrgyzstan. And, obviously here, the trick is that, we're working with these lovely sort of lines, these recession lines as the meltwater pool drains overnight, while simultaneously acquiring a new crust of ice on the surface. Those lines, those shapes in the foreground are sort of the main foreground subject, obviously, but then we're working with a reflection of the mountain against the pool of ice, and the position of the camera radically changes the position of the top of the peak, and so you want to find the spot where you're obviously working the foreground shapes the way you want, and the peak ends up in just the right spot as well. Here, we talked about the icebergs against the sky. This is, bristlecone pine, actually a toppled bristlecone pine in the White Mountains in California. Just after a rainstorm had blown through, and I sort of drove into a position where I thought I might find a rainbow, and sure enough, jumped out of the car, and the key was, I was scrambling to find a foreground subject, and I found this root in lovely light, and just wanted to find a position where I could put it in relation to that the rainbow, obviously. So the key here is finding the position where I could have that curve of the root, creating sort of a tangential diagonal with the curve of the arc of the rainbow. And if you're ever curious about where rainbows form, they're going to be 42 degrees around the anti-solar point, which is basically the shadow of your head. And here the key, this is just mist in Victoria Falls in Africa, catching the afternoon sun, waiting for the mist to be in the right spot to also catch the secondary arc just outside, about 9 degrees outside the primary arc. And then there's the aerial perspective. Getting up in a helicopter can be a real joy, and now we have drones that make it a lot easier and less expensive, to at least relative to helicopter time. This was shot from a helicopter. This is a set of braided rivers in Iceland, it's wonderful how you can sort of take these things out of context and frame them up so that it removes a lot of sort of the content that would give a sense of scale or sort of bring you back to earth in terms of what you're really looking at, and just work with a pure abstract design. And this is a rare pleasure. This was the Iceland eruption last year, or not last year, but 2 years ago now. This was the best position we could get to on foot. Basically, that this was about something like 200 meters away from the vent, the erupting vent, and it was as close as we could get safely. And even so, we were getting pumice, cooled lava turning into pumice and raining down on us if the wind was coming from the right direction. But this was a situation that, when I was planning this trip on very short notice after the eruption started, it started in March, and we brought a group of clients over there in May, early May, I think. And I just knew I wanted to get an aerial perspective on this, and I'd never owned a drone before, and I thought to myself, I've got to get a drone for this, because I will kill myself, I will kick myself if I don't have aerials of this. And so, sure enough, after some technical issues initially trying to get it going, I was able to get it into the air on, I think, the second night, and do some aerial stuff, including the view down into the crater itself. This was just before it erupted. It was erupting, I think, something like every 4 to 8 minutes or something like that. Okay, subtraction and isolation. So this is something, I have a lecture that I give called Subtracting the Universe. That's about the idea that, that painters start out with a blank canvas and then add to it whatever they want. Whereas we start out with the universe and then we carve away everything we don't want. And this is a marble cave in Patagonia in Chile. And the key here is just isolating these lines and forms and eliminating anything distracting along the edges as best you can, and making sure that in this case you're all in even shade light. You don't have stray sunlight coming into either the water or the rock and that sort of thing. So it's playing with this stuff is endlessly fascinating to me. And similar situation, this is a very different subject. This is a rusting whale oil drum in South Georgia Island that's just been pockmarked by weather and freeze thaw and all that kind of stuff, and old coats of paint and whale oil and whatever else. But I love doing these kinds of finding these designs and sort of abstracts in nature and in man-made situations. And I've always had a passion for ice for some reason. I just love ice. I've been doing ice pictures or ice abstracts since I was in college, and something that I can't stop doing. And the key here is perspective and framing and finding the position where things layer properly and separate. And this is a backlit, actually it's the same iceberg as the previous image, but backlit situation with the light, translucent ice. It's the close-up detail of the same thing. And again, South Georgia Island, this is when you're confronted with a scene like this, what do you do? And the key, in this situation, obviously, is the way to convey the scale of hundreds of thousands of king penguins is to do a picture that's just edge to edge, corner to corner, nothing but king penguins, and then you start picking away at it and finding the ways to isolate individuals in the cluster of the woolly chicks that have just been born, that hatched that season. And this is a black-browed albatross. After spending lots of time photographing them in flight or on their nests and that sort of thing, and doing courtship behavior and all that, I had this opportunity to just get in just close enough to one with a long lens that I could sort of make the bird itself the background to its own sort of wonderful shapes and color. Long exposure. So we mentioned before how we don't really see this with our eyes when we're out there in the field. Obviously, this is a pretty typical kind of thing that we think about in terms of using long exposures for blurring water, in a waterfall. But you can also do things like this, where this is these are waves actually on a transit from the Falklands to South Georgia Island. And I was out on deck. There wasn't really a whole lot going on, but there was this the glare of the sun reflecting in the waves behind the ship. And this was really bright, and so bright that you couldn't really look at it with your bare eyes without sunglasses. And I just thought to myself, well, what's really happening here is that we actually have all these pinpoint specular highlights that are adding up to one big sort of field of glare. But if you ran a long exposure on it with a strong neutral density filter, every one of those specular highlights would render as a sharp line. So I started playing with running these long exposures of maybe 1.5 or 2 seconds. And this sort of thing, once you get the idea and you realize that there's something to it, and you can actually create sort of a coherent design with enough texture and shape to actually yield an interesting image, you just keep at it, keep doing iterations, look at your results, and then use that feedback to fine tune your shutter speed and your framing and all that sort of thing. And eventually, if you do this enough, there will be one that really stands out above all the rest as sort of the strongest design. And this is a similar situation here where I'm shooting ice on this black sand beach in Iceland, and I've got direct sunlight on the water. And normally, if you shot this at a fast shutter speed, the water would have a lot of texture and information in it, and would be very, it would really, so much texture that it would compete with the foreground subject. I'm really trying to focus your attention on the ice. And so running along exposure both blurs out the water, but it also has the effect of, as these specular highlights move across the surface of the water, the brightness gets distributed across a larger area and therefore gets knocked down. So the highlights on the water are no longer near as bright as they would be in a single or in a fast exposure, I should say. So it's just this is just purely a technical solution to a creative problem. And this is on at Bailey Head on Deception Island in Antarctica, and this is a huge, like 200,000 bird chinstrap penguin colony, and we'd photograph the birds jumping in and out of the surf and getting chased by leopard seals and getting attacked by giant petrels and skuas and things like that. Lots of wildlife action. And then I just wanted to do something that was sort of more, a little calmer, and that was a little more about the experience of being on that beach with the birds coming and going, but sort of the cycle of it, the waves washing in and out. So I just, again, I put on an ND filter to force a long exposure. And knowing that enough of the penguins would stand still long enough that you'd be able to read them as penguins, and penguins are pretty mature subjects that we recognize pretty readily, so we don't need to worry too much about people wondering what that is. I mean, look at it and say, yeah, it's a penguin. But it's just, this is all about the mood and sort of the feel of the sort of the serenity of the place. And you find a really strong foreground subject like this, and again, dealing with water as your background, and a short exposure is going to create lots of texture and information in that surface, where you may want a simpler, cleaner, sort of more minimalist kind of look that focuses your attention on the main subject. So this was at least a 2-minute exposure, I think, with an ND filter. And this was a 4-minute exposure, also shot in this last Antarctica trip. Yeah, it's funny because here we were in this incredible wildlife mecca with whales and several different kinds of seals and different kinds of penguins and skuas and all these different marine birds and things. And after shooting lots of wildlife, sometimes it's nice just to settle down with some calm rocks that aren't going to go anywhere on you, and just sort of take a deep breath and enjoy the serenity. In the dark, okay, night photography. I don't really do a whole lot of night photography, but when it's good, it can be really good. This is the moon in Torres del Paine National Park through a high cloud that's refracting the moonlight, so you get the sort of rainbow color. That was pretty special. I think this tends to happen when you have high clouds with ice crystals, but it's something to look out for. This is Kantengri in Kyrgyzstan, just illuminated by the full moon at night. It was a fairly long exposure to render the star trails. And the aurora borealis in Greenland. Greenland is especially the Scoresby Sund area is sort of in the sweet spot for aurora. So often, there you can have the aurora right overhead, and you get these converging sort of columns of light that are just, it's just straight up above you. And literally, I had the camera pointed directly up at this stuff, and it's really quite spectacular. And the really interesting thing is, when you're standing there, our eyes don't have the sensitivity to see colors this intense in dark conditions, because we're basically picking up luminance with the rods in our eyes and the cone cells in our eyes are things that pick up color, and they're not as sensitive. So you do have the sense that things are a little greenish and stuff, and you may not even see the magenta color, but on the camera, it's all there. And city photography. This is the city of lights. So photograph the lights in Paris. It's a great place for night photography. It's always a lot of fun. And just a reminder that you don't have to go to exotic places to do interesting photographs or night photographs. I shot this in my home. I just, glanced up one night with all the lights off, and there was street lights coming through the windows and making these interesting shapes on the walls and ceiling. And I just had to get my camera out and set it up. And, sometimes I even have to force myself to get out and photograph when I'm when I'm home and do local stuff, because when I'm on a trip, I'm clearly focused on teaching and helping other people with their photography and photographing alongside them. And I'm out with my camera all the time, but at home I get focused on family stuff and work and whatever. And it's sometimes I remind myself that there are good pictures to be made around here too. Now, black and white. So black and white is it's a wonderful tool. I mean, some people, they only do black and white. Some people never do black and white, but I think it's a really important thing to keep in the back of your head, because it can broaden your range of options in situations that might otherwise be considered marginal for color work anyway. And this is a picture in Kyrgyzstan to a location that we go that's out in the middle of nowhere, and like literally we'll go out there and see nobody else, with 19,000 foot mountains along the Chinese border. And this was a day when the light was this was sort of late afternoon. The light hadn't gotten good for sunset yet, but it was this is the color version. It's not all that exciting. If in color, you probably think, I'll wait a while until the light gets better, but it's actually prime conditions for black and white. And knowing that you can pull this out of it, black and white gives you so much more flexibility in terms of what you can do tonally and with contrast. Whereas with color, if you made this kind of aggressive contrast move, it would look artificial and bizarre. This is the moon setting behind clouds behind the Taurus Alpine in Patagonia, with light, like just glimmer of light on the eastern horizon, filling in the mountains in the foreground. And this is an aerial, and this is really for color. This would have been really awful conditions. This is a helicopter flying over the Tian Shan Mountains in Kyrgyzstan, but in black and white, it works. Now this is not I would not call this a great photograph, but I think it's a really educational situation, because can you believe that this picture came from that original exposure? And this was in Nepal, and we were doing a trip partially to hike around the Everest region, but we also visited the area around the Annapurna Massif, and I wanted to try to do some photography of Machapachari, which is a particularly beautiful mountain. And I had this location all set up for, I figured out exactly where I wanted to go do like sunrises and sunsets and things like that. And we went out there on this day, and there was this horrible atmospheric conditions with like smoke blowing in from India, and you just could hardly see anything. And here, you can see the hills at the very bottom of the frame, the closest hills, but everything's sort of just disappearing into this haze. And it was really murky like this. But the incredible thing is there was enough contrast there that with a really radical contrast adjustments in Lightroom, I could actually pull that out of it. I mean, it's just astounding. And because it's originally a color image and all the color data is there, I was just curious to see what would happen if I converted it back to color. After making, some of the adjustments I made were changes to the color data to get the kind of contrast I wanted. And when I switched it back to color, that's what it looked like. Right. So that's if I had processed the color image to yield that, or I did process the color image to yield that black and white image, this is what the color data looks like, which is just kind of fascinating to me.
One of the disadvantages of Zoom is you don't get to hear people's reactions.
Oh, right. Yeah, well, yeah. I could guess.
Yeah, just want to let you know.
Yeah. And this is sort of my version or homage to Ansel's Moonrise Hernandez, New Mexico shot. This is in a lake called Songkul in Kyrgyzstan. And it was sort of a similar situation. This is how it looked in color. It wasn't great light. It's actually kind of a nice, quiet kind of composition, maybe. But I knew that with black and white, I could do something really dramatic. And so I took a lot of layers and not layers, but masks in Lightroom mostly. And tweaking different color data and all that sort of thing to get the tones and contrast where I wanted them. But it ends up sort of maximizing the graphics of the shapes in the image and the relationship of the moon to the clouds and all that. And again, if I switch back to the color data if I go from the black and white version and just switch back to color, that's what it looks like. So this is all the color processing. Well, the color processing for the black and white in color mode, which this just looks silly, but anyway. So multiple exposures. I'm almost done, by the way. I know I'm a little bit over time, but multiple exposures. I think this is something that is really important to keep in the back of your mind. Now, this is a film image of the 40-meter radio telescope at the Owens Valley Radio Observatory in California. And I was out there watching this thing, and the way it works, you have all these different scientists and different research projects that are getting telescope time. And so they basically each have a particular task they want to assign to the telescope, and they get some slot of time where it's going to look at a certain part of the sky they want it to look at for some period of time. And so the dish will just be sitting dead still and silent, and then suddenly it'll get a task to reposition, and suddenly it goes and suddenly twists and points at a different part of the sky, and then 10 minutes 20 minutes later it does the same thing. It turns a totally different direction to look at something else. And after a while just watching this, I sort of thought, well, how do you photograph that? Like this idea of seeking, like this idea of this dish on Earth that's trying to look out into the universe and sort of looking all around the sky, searching for things. And I thought, well, multiple exposure, and so this is on film, so it's one piece of film without advancing the camera, and then it basically just figured out what the exposure should be, and then divided it up by 10 or 10 or 12. So I did 12 frames as I walked around the telescope. And with digital cameras now, you can do this sort of thing too. A lot of digital cameras will have the feature to allow you to stack images in camera, and obviously you can do this in post-processing too. This is another film image where this is a trick I used to use when I couldn't get a shutter speed fast enough to freeze the freeze wind motion or something. Shooting 50 or 100 speed slide film as I used to do. And so one trick was to just divide it up into, say, eight exposures on the same piece of film. So you'd, rather than having just blurred leaves blowing in the wind, you'd at least get the hard edges of the leaves at a faster shutter speed, and then you'd shoot 8 exposures, and the cumulative exposure would give you the exposure you needed on the film. And again, something you can do with digital too. This was a digital multiple exposure, and the trick here was that there was waves breaking over these rocks in Oregon, but they weren't all breaking over the rocks where I wanted them all at the same time. And so the idea was I'd shoot an exposure when a wave had just come over and was sort of just running off or running over the rocks in a particular position, and then I'd wait until it was coming over in another position, and so on. And eventually you sort of get the waves where you want them, and it also has the effect of building up the foam on the surface of the water, and builds up that texture, but also reduces the contrast in it, because you're getting more and more texture, but at each interface between the highlights and the foam and the sort of the darker areas of clear water, reduces the overall brightness of the foam. And another type of sort of multiple exposure kind of thing is a stitched composition. So this is a 5-frame stitch of a rhododendron in the redwoods up in Redwoods National and State Parks. And I shot this with a 45mm tilt shift lens on a Nikon with the camera oriented vertically, so that the long dimension of the sensor would become the short dimension of the final image to maximize resolution. And with the tilt shift lens, I was able to shift the camera, shift the lens up, or shift the lens to look up while keeping the camera back parallel to the redwood trunk, so I wouldn't get converging lines. And then you throw it into or have it stitch the panoramic in Lightroom, and you get that. And this is a really good tool, not just for increasing the resolution of your images, if you want to make big prints, but it also gives you different options in terms of framing, of format shape, because personally I've never found the 35mm format very it just doesn't really fit me very well. I feel like it's a little bit too oblong for most things, and it's not like a true panoramic. And so for most rectangular compositions, I tend to favor something that's closer to a 4x5, a little bit squarer, or a really true sort of panoramic kind of format like 6x12 or 6x17. So this helps me solve that problem. This is a 24mm tilt shift stitch with just, it's just three exposures, just shooting one to the left, one in the middle, and one in the right, using the shift function on the lens. So I could tilt the lens to get focus from near to far, and then have 3 overlapping frames using the shift function of the lens without rotating the camera, which gives you sort of better geometry for the stitch. And a long lens, you can stitch with long lenses too. This was in Torres del Paine with sunrise. This is probably, I don't know, six overlapping frames, something like that. But this sort of thing, if you're on a tripod, as long as you level the pan base and overlap about 30 to 50%, it's dead easy. Same thing. This is Kantengri in Kyrgyzstan, same thing. And you can do vertical stitches too, which can be handy. This is in New Zealand, and the trick with this one, this is facilitated if you use a ball head, where you can flop the ball over into a notch and sort of rotate vertically like that, so you keep everything on axis. Because if you try to tilt the head like this, then things are going to start going screwy on you in terms of the geometry of the scene, especially if you have anything close to the camera. But don't forget that you can do vertical stitches as well. And focus stacking, which I do a lot of these days when the conditions are right. It gives you massive control over your depth of field. And this is a little water course in Death Valley just after some rains, and with a 120 macro lens on a Fuji medium format camera. And it's just I have to say that my little plug for Fujifilm is that they've implemented really good functionality for focus stacking, where you identify the near point that you want to have in focus, you identify the far point, and based on the lens you're using and the aperture you've set, it will automatically calculate exactly how far out it needs to refocus to overlap your zones of depth of field, and it does it automatically, and it's really very good at it. This is a short telephoto. This is a super wide. This is the equivalent. Excuse me. It's the equivalent of about an 18mm lens on a Grand Canyon raft trip, and just getting down into this water course in Caponigro Canyon, and everything from foot from the camera to 30 feet away is all in focus. And you just dump the images into Helicon focus and let it rip. Ice details in Kyrgyzstan, same thing. And this was a neat situation in Iceland, where I was in this ice cave, And the range of depth in terms of distance in this shot from near to far is about 12 feet. And I'm shooting this with it's a short telephoto. But everything in this shot is actually sharp, and this wouldn't be possible otherwise. And even, I mean, these are all non-moving subjects other than the water, right? So these are situations that focus stacking is great for, because obviously, nothing can move. If anything moves, then you get, things don't line up properly. So this is actually a picture in Dolly Sods in West Virginia. And, fortunately, there wasn't a breath of wind, and I was actually able to pull this off it's probably a 12 frame focus stack. And, I just was crossing my fingers the whole time, but nothing moved. It was really quite amazing that if the conditions are right, it can work in really amazing situations. And of course, I mean, a lot of you have probably played with high dynamic range exposures. And, I find that these days, it always amazes me that, I'll shoot an HDR thinking that there's not enough, one exposure isn't going to capture all the total data in the image. But often it does. But still, there are conditions or situations where it comes in handy. And this was in an abandoned farmhouse in North Dakota, one of our workshops. And the contrast with the direct sunlight and the sort of reflections on the metal and all that, and the deep shadows in the back was enough that I needed an HDR for this one. And it's probably just 3 frames bracketed and then merged in Lightroom. And this is actually very, very close to that other redwood shot and rhododendron shot in the North Coast redwoods. And when you're shooting into the sun like this, and you've got the sun in the frame and really serious highlights and also deep dark shadows, that's a situation for HDR. And it just gives you a lot more data, primarily in your shadows, and then allows you to hold the highlights. So this gives you more options in processing. And with that, thank you for your time and attention. I hope it was helpful. And please, feel free to follow up with questions if you have any. And if you're interested in more information about our workshops or anything, I'd be happy to provide them, and you can find us at visionarywild.com, and then my own portfolio website is justinblackphoto.com. But anyway, thanks for listening, and sorry I went over a little bit, but that always happens.
I think we started a little late too, so.
Oh, that's true. Okay, I don't feel so bad anymore.
Yeah. Well, we just have a few minutes for questions. If somebody has a question, we can take that now.
I have a question.
A question.
How much traffic competition was there for drones over that volcano?
Could you hear that?
In Iceland?
Yeah.
It was, so when I got there in early May, there were actually very few foreigners showing up yet. So most of the people, I would say 95% of the people going out there were Icelanders, and they were getting about 3,000 visitors a day. And this was at a location that was about, it was about an hour, something like an hour drive out of Reykjavik. And then the approach hike was, a solid half hour, 45 minutes, something like that, to get out to the closest sort of viewing point. And there were a lot of people around, but it was really impressive. In this country, they would have had everything roped off and closed for liability reasons. And in Iceland, the way they handled it was they had these volunteer like mountain rescue teams that were going out there with these little gas sensors and detecting concentrations of carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide and that sort of thing. And both of those are heavier than air, so that would settle down into the valley, and we were up on a hill. So as long as you stayed up high enough, it was pretty safe. But if somebody started to go down too low, they just sort of informed them that they might die, so they should probably go back up the hill. And it was people were out there barbecuing on the hot lava rocks and all kinds of crazy stuff. But unfortunately, there were a few crazy people there was one guy who ran out across the freshly cooled lava up onto the incredibly unstable cone and look down in. Unfortunately, he survived, but he could have punched through like the thin crust into a lava tube or something like that at any point. So he got very lucky. But it was.
Were there a lot of drones as well?
Oh yes. That was the drone-eating volcano. I think probably a few dozen drones were sacrificed to that volcano god. And I think some of them deliberately, because they really wanted to get the shot of the drone flying with like the lava erupting right in front of it. And they knew that they would get taken out, but they were beaming back the video, and as long as they had the video, they didn't care. So there were quite a few drones. Yeah, at first there weren't they weren't flying helicopters in there, but then later on, I think by June they were doing helicopter flights over it and all kinds of stuff. So, but yeah, if that ever happens again, I'll definitely be zipping back to Iceland. It's well worth it, as long as it's in a spot that's reasonably accessible.
Another question?
Sure.
Perhaps somebody online from Zoom?
I guess I have one.
Oh, okay. We got one here.
That shot that you took of it was a waterfall and it had some circular eddies in front.
Yep.
Did you use a polarizer or anything for those eddies or not?
I almost certainly used a polarizer. And I may have used, I think I got about an 8-second exposure on that, and 8 or 10 seconds. And I can't remember if I had to use an ND filter or not, but if I did, it would have been something like, no, I don't think I did actually. I think it was just a polarizer. But yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Sure.
The shot that you had in Oregon, where there was like either seals or sea lions on on all these rocks, where was that taken in Oregon?
That was at Shore Acres State Park.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, not too far from Bandon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. Just loved it. Your work is spectacular.
Thank you. Very, very kind.
Thank you. No, thank you. My question regards focus stacking. I believe I heard correctly that you use Hillebron, the software.
I use Helicon Focus.
Helicon, right.
Yeah.
So I know there are a couple out there. And for example, that incredible image with the triangular ice, like what did you do? 10, 20, 30, 50 images that you photostat?
You're talking about this one?
No, keep going. Keep that one.
This one here?
No, the one before that. That one. No.
Oh, this one here.
That one, yes.
Got it. Yeah, this is pretty close up. So this is an area that, from top to bottom, is probably about 1 foot in terms of dimensions.
Right.
And yeah, so at this magnification, it would have been quite a few. I would guess something like 24, maybe, even at f/16.
Right. 24, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you use a rail? You have your camera on a railing system?
No, I don't. This is just the camera refocusing itself. Basically, you identify the near point. You basically select near point A, and then you refocus to whatever the most distant point is that you want it to focus out to, and then it will calculate all the intermediate steps and refocus them automatically. And then the software, because as focus changes, magnification changes slightly. So the software has to then, basically rescale all of the images so they line up and the magnification is the same.
Of course. So I'm not familiar with this software. Is that something that you upload to your camera?
No, that's all. It's all in the Helicon focus is all post-processing. So you can export to Helicon from Lightroom, and then
I see.
it'll automatically save the processed image back into Lightroom. But the camera's doing all the focus calculations.
Correct. However, you did say that the camera would automatically take 25 images from the nearest focus to the furthest focus? Is that,
Yep.
I misinterpreted that, right?
It will. So yeah, the Fujifilm cameras will, as long as you give it the near point, the far point, it then, figures out based on the lens that's being used and the aperture you have set, how far it can refocus while, having good overlapping depth of field. So you get everything sharp. And I'm not sure what Sony's do, but I think Nikon's have always, you can tell it to shoot up to so many frames until it gets to infinity. Basically when you are telling it how far to focus between frames, the control is basically a 1 to 10 scale, which is basically less or more. And it's very imprecise. So I'm really impressed with what Fujifilm's done with it.